You know, people say, I love, you know, America, I'm just having
I hate the policy.
I hate the policy, sure.
And we're responsible for the policy. It's a free country. We can't say, you know, I don't have any responsibility for the policy, because we do. We may not know about it, but then we should find out about it. And if we decide we don't like it, we should change it. In fact, take a look at the question we've just been discussing, two-state settlement. Right. About 2/3 of the American population supports the international consensus on this, and long
Which
has.
is there ought to be a two-state solution.
Roughly the 67
right.
borders.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting to look at the polls. I mean, polls will, you find roughly 2/3 of the population saying, yeah, they support that. And roughly the same proportion says the U.S. ought to become more involved in the diplomacy. People don't know that that's a contradiction. The reason that that program has not been achieved is because of consistent U.S. intervention to prevent it from being achieved. And that continues at this very moment, in fact. Okay, it is a free country. We've got a lot of freedom. That means people have the opportunity to discover its work. You know, it's not going to come easily. It's where the internet is helpful. They have the opportunity to discover the relevant facts and background, which should show them that their position is contradictory. They must come to understand what the U.S. government role has been over the years in preventing the outcome that they want.
Okay. Do you in the end then, if in fact, accept the premise that people get, for the most part in a democracy, people get the government they deserve?
No, I don't.
You don't?
No, in fact,
and you, because
not
you
at all.
Well, let me finish. Because you believe the political process is corrupt.
It's not corrupt.
It's what?
Look.
See, whenever anybody says, look to me, I know they're saying
it's not that simple.
Right.
I mean, it's not that there's robbery and stealing of elections. There is a distribution of power internal to the country, enormous disparity of economic and other power. And that influences everything that happens in dramatic ways. So many issues simply don't come up in elections.
So the haves have more power than the have-nots, and therefore
overwhelmingly.
they're able to exercise
in fact,
it.
If you really look closely, elections, they restrict themselves to issues on which the population, they eliminate issues where the mass of the population opposes a lead opinion, systematically. And the population is aware of this.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Well, let's take a concrete case,
right.
Okay? The year 2000 election, say. Among the issues that were highest in concern to the general population are things that roughly relate to the so-called trade agreements. So deficits, overseas investment, the transfer of jobs, you know, lots of topics like that. Right at that time, there was a plan for an international hemispheric conference at Quebec, hemispheric summit a few months later, which was intended to extend the NAFTA-type agreement to the whole hemisphere. Now, these are issues of enormous concern to people. Did it come up in the election? No. And there's a reason why it didn't come up in the election, and it's consistent. On those issues, the public tends to oppose policies on which there is an elite consensus, and therefore it doesn't come up in elections. Well, that's part of the reflection.
But I mean, let me just make sure I understand. How do you stand yourself on the NAFTA agreement?
I agree with the general population. I think if
you agree with the general population, whose view is
critical.
Critical of it because
it's the wrong agreement. If you go back to 1990, 10 years ago, when the NAFTA agreement was coming along, there were serious critical analyses of it, which were in favor of a North American free trade agreement, but not this one. The analyses came from the labor movement. They came from Congress's Research Bureau, the Office of Technology Assessment. Pretty much the same analyses said, yeah, a North American economic agreement would be a good idea, but this one is designed as effectively an investor rights agreement. It privileges rights of investors and lenders, and it marginalizes the rights of people.
And were you worried about the loss of jobs and those kinds of issues that became a political football? The unions essentially were opposed to it.
That's the story, but it's not true.
Not true. In other words, you're saying that then they misled us when they made that argument?
No, the unions did not make
They never made an argument that we were opposed because of jobs.
They mentioned that, but the labor movement had an official position. It was produced by the Labor Advisory Council along detailed analysis, and it was a very sensible position. It was never given, it never entered the media discussion. It was never given any publicity. The labor movement was accused of crude nationalism, this, that, and the other thing. That was not their position. Their actual position never made it to the public agenda. And the same is true of Congress's own research bureau, which had a rather similar analysis. Yes, in favor of a NAFTA-style agreement, but not that one. It's kind of interesting that a few days ago, the Carnegie Endowment released an analysis of NAFTA, saying a fairly critical analysis. It was reported in the press, making some proposals as to how it should have been done. And those proposals, though they didn't say so, happen to be very similar to those that were proposed by the labor movement and Congress's Research Bureau 10 years ago, but didn't enter the political discussion, was not mentioned in the media, for example. Well, this is only one example of which there are numerous ones.
Basically saying that what you're arguing is that people are not getting the information they need to make wise choices.
They aren't, nor in fact are they given the choice. They aren't given the choice.
The choice between who are the two parties nominated in an election.
No, that they have, but the two parties represent essentially the same concentration of interests.
Concentration of economic power.
Look, the United States is essentially a one-party state. It has two factions of the business party. In fact, one of the leading political science analyses of the nature of the U.S. party system by a fine political scientist at the University of Massachusetts, Tom Ferguson, is what he calls the investment theory of politics. Investors get together to invest to control the state.
Well, let me ask you this. Let's take 2 or 3 countries where you and I know, okay? We have 2 parties in the United Kingdom, right? Mm-hmm. We have the Tory Party and the Labour Party. Would you say the same thing about them? Essentially?
It depends when. Today, today it's close to true.
Okay. In France, you have a Socialist Party and the Chirac Gaullist Party. Essentially the same. I mean, there's not a whole lot of differences there. I mean, they have 35-hour week. In Spain, we have Socialist Party.
Yeah. Well, I would suggest we take.
Is it any different in any of those countries in terms of how much difference there is between the two parties? Because let me make this argument with you and just get the. Essentially, in most countries, the battle in politics is for the center, is it not? In most places. Now, that doesn't mean that.
That's simply not true. I mean, there are countries that have a much more lively democratic culture. So let's take a country that has a really lively democratic culture, much more than we do.
Like?
Brazil.
Okay.
Brazil is a rich, potentially rich, important country. Yeah. In Brazil, something just happened recently, which should humiliate us. They give us a real lesson in democracy. In Brazil, popular movements, large-scale popular movements, which had been developing over 20 years, reached a scale where they were able to elect a populist president over the opposition of highly concentrated capital and media concentration. We can't even dream of that.
Well,
that's a functioning democratic culture.
Let me stop you for a second. Let me just get a couple of questions in. Number one, I asked that question recently of Gary Wills was here. Mm-hmm. Why haven't we seen in the United States more success by a powerful coalition, essentially coming from the left, but not necessarily defined by what the conception, traditional conventional wisdom might be of the left, of labor, minorities, poor,
we have
black
seen
and white.
We have seen it.
What was it the last time you saw it?
A number of times. We saw it in the 60s. That's where the Great Society programs come from. We saw it in the 30s. That's where the New Deal comes from. And in fact, this is a battle that goes back to the origins of American history. The original constitutional framework, the way Madison...
The author of the Great Society programs was Lyndon Johnson.
That's right. And the programs are not initiated by leaders. That's a serious misunderstanding.
Well, those programs were initiated primarily by people who actually, many of them who'd served with FDR.
See, that's a serious misinterpretation, I believe, of the way the political system works. Leaders may sign their names and they may push programs, but they do it because a popular constituency is compelling them to do it. That's the way changes take place. I mean, if there's a large-scale popular movement and there are pressures, there'll be somebody who'll say, I'm your leader, I'll sign it.
But since you've made the Great
Society...
And
what happened in the programs that came out of the so-called Great Society were the result of popular ferment and activism and changes that were taking place, significant changes that were taking place in the 1960s, which very much democratized the society. And it led to these programs. Since then, there's been an enormous counterattack from business sectors trying to beat it back. And that's the course of history. You know, it's the same with the civil rights movement. It was the same with the labor movement.
But let me make this point about Lyndon Johnson, because a lot of other things, and I want to say that we're 42 minutes in, we're doing an hour with you, and I want to invite you back, because inevitably people are going to say to me, you know, you could have gone for 2 or 3 hours, and you know, or they will say you interrupted too much, or they'll say a lot of other things, and I do want to hear from you, and you know, many people saw Lyndon Johnson, you know, as a man who was too beholden to economic interest. In terms of how he achieved his own wealth, and in terms of a whole range of things, whether it was brown root in Texas, or whether his relationship with a whole lot of institutions. But you were saying that he responded the way he did to great society programs having to do with medical care, having to do with poverty, having to do with a whole range of issues.
He responded
and
to
civil
public
rights
pressures.
Because the public pressure was there.
The same was true of John F. Kennedy.
I'm willing to argue with you that Lyndon Johnson responded in part because that was where his heart was, and his sense of legacy in terms of what had influenced him.
Yeah.
You know,
See,
and secondly, some of the things that John Kennedy responded to, he saw his opportunity in history, in a sense, to show that he could get these things enacted, because that was his principal skill.
See, we're not disagreeing. We're talking about different topics.
Okay. Let me move.
The topic that you're talking about is individual personalities. So the individual personality, Lyndon Johnson, what was going on in his mind. The topic that I'm talking about is how popular movements develop, create their own programs, press for them, finally often get somebody to initiate them. Those are different questions.
Okay, and I may agree with you, actually. I mean, I look with great interest in what's happening in Brazil.
Yeah. And here, it's happened here. That's why do we have freedom of speech? I mean, freedom of speech is not in the Constitution. It's not in the Bill of Rights. In fact, up until the it's not. Up until the 1960s. In fact, the legal battles about freedom of speech are mostly in the 20th century. And there was no real legal protection for substantial freedom of speech, actually, until the 60s. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court finally, first in the course of the Civil Rights Movement, then later in the decade, finally realized a level of legal protection of freedom of speech that, to my knowledge, doesn't exist in any other country. And a large part of it grew out of the activism of the Civil Rights Movement.
Just to understand you, because I want to go to some things that are often attached to you and bring great controversy to you. Other than freedom of speech, what else do you think is part of what America represents? Yes.
Represents.
Well, is.
Good about American life. Well, there's a lot of things I like that are, I think, great about American life. For one thing, we have, compared with other societies, there's very little in the way of a kind of a caste system. Yeah. So people interact independently of social position.
Is there meritocracy?
There is, certainly in terms of policy formation. That's overwhelming. But we're talking in terms of personal interaction. Does it matter whether this is what you do or that's what you do? Yeah. Well, these interactions among people, informal interactions, are, in my view, much healthier in the United States than other societies that I know. Now, those are important facts about a culture. Freedom of speech is not just a matter of law. It's a matter of being internalized, realizing, understanding that's my right and I'm going to defend it. That's important. And the same is true of other rights. Actually, the United States has become a much more civilized society since the 1960s, just in our recent lifetimes.
Because, do you think?
Well, because of popular activism. Let's take women's rights. Was that an issue 40 years ago? No. Environmental issues. Did they exist 40 years ago? No. Let's take something like opposition to aggression and violence. Attitudes on that have changed enormously. I mean, when John F. Kennedy attacked South Vietnam, as he did in 1962, direct attack. You mean his assassination of Jim, or what? No. When the U.S. Air Force first sent their supporters. See, I mean, there was so little opposition to this that no one even knows what happened. But if you look back at the record, the historical and documentary record, it's not controversial. Yeah. In 1962, Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam. They did it in South Vietnamese planes with Vietnamese markings, but it was U.S. pilots and U.S. equipment, thin cover. He authorized the use of napalm. He started the crop destruction programs to keep food from the indigenous rebels. Wait a minute, he started driving
no, wait a
millions
minute,
of... Look, this is a war. Was there any protest?
No.
Okay, now that's changed.
Well, there may have been somebody who wasn't significant.
Look, I can tell you because I was directly involved in
it. Well, we've got to know you because of your opposition to Vietnam.
You couldn't get 4 people in a room to talk about it.
I'm not arguing about this.
But this is important about the country. It was 4 or 5 years before a significant popular movement developed opposing an aggressive war against another country. Let's fast forward to today.
Right.
In this year, there were huge popular protests before the war was officially launched. That's a tremendous change in consciousness.
And why do you think that change took place? Because of the 60s? Because as it breathes, it gets wider and stronger? And
the change took place because a lot of people worked very hard to make it change place. The same is true of civil rights, of women's rights, of environmental issues, and so on. That's the way changes happen. The same thing happened in Brazil. The popular movements developed that way, not by some leader saying,
I agree with you. I do agree with you on that. I'm not arguing that. But the interesting thing about Brazil now, which is worthy of a program here, and he is somebody that I've heard him speak and would like to see him at the table, is he is disappointing some of his followers there because of some positions he's taking having to do with the rainforest and other issues.
You know why?
Why?
Because there are...
How come you know so much about everything?
Well, check it and see if it's right.
No,
I'm not trying to persuade you or anyone else.
No.
Here's what I think, and I think if you investigate this, what you'll find.
All right.
Over the last 20 or 30 years, in part as a reaction to the democratizing tendencies of the 60s, which were worldwide.
Right.
They were dramatic here, but also elsewhere. There's been a backlash. Part of the backlash, it's taken many forms. One of the forms it's taken is international economic arrangements, which are virtually designed to undermine democracy. Well, what's called in the rest of the world neoliberal arrangements. Here it's called free trade, but it's not free trade. The array of international arrangements that's sort of formalized in the World Trade Organization. Those measures, if you look at them, it is well understood that they undermine democracy. One of the first measures that was taken in the early 70s, initially here, but then everywhere, was to free up flow of financial capital.
Right. I need to move on because I got a few minutes. That's my point.
I won't try to explain anything, but let me just say that if you look at these arrangements, you'll find that they undermine democracy and they place countries in a stranglehold in which they cannot follow the policies of the overwhelming majority. And that's what's happening in Brazil, and that's why Lula's disappointing his constituency.
Okay, fine. I'll move on. I talked to someone else, knowing that you were coming in. They said, I was in Iraq recently, and I met no Iraqi who said the war was a mistake. Lots of them in the idea of overthrowing Saddam, even now, and many of them wish the United States would leave. Many of them are terribly disappointed, upset, opposed to the way things are going. But this person said, I didn't meet anyone. Tell me how you feel about the use of American power in overthrowing Saddam. Was it because it violated your own sense of international law? Was it because that we didn't have, it wasn't a UN initiation?
I'm not going to be able to answer the question because the assumptions are wrong.
Okay, go ahead.
The United States was not in favor of overthrowing Saddam Hussein. In fact, George Bush made that explicit. At the Azores summit, a couple of days before the invasion started, Bush and Blair were there, and they issued a declaration in which Bush said, even if Saddam Hussein and his family leave the country, we're going to invade anyway. And in fact, that's consistent with a long-standing U.S. policy. You're right that I'm sure every sane person in Iraq wanted to get rid of Saddam Hussein, just like I have for 20 years, just like we all have. He's a murderous tyrant. Right. Why is he there? Why wasn't he overthrown? Or to ask another question, why do the majority of Iraqis, when Iraqis are we have the published polls, Iraqis are asked, who's your favorite foreign leader? The favorite foreign leader of Iraqis, according to U.S.-run polls, is President Chirac of France, who was the symbol of opposition to the invasion. George Bush is far below, Blair even less below. Nevertheless, the same polls say, yeah, we're glad to get rid of Saddam Hussein. Well, if we want to think about this, we'll be able to figure out what's happening. Sure, they would like to get rid of Saddam Hussein. They would have liked to have gotten rid of him years ago. I mean, in 1991, they almost did get rid of him. But the U.S. supported Saddam so that he could crush the rebellion, which probably would have overthrown him. And we know why.
Well, I'm not sure they supported him so that he could crush the rebellion.
They authorized him. They effectively authorized him to crush the rebellion.
I'm not sure that many people... but you got to...
Let's look back to the...
At least let me make one point. Yeah. Is that, I mean, it clearly was a mistake in 1991.
Well, was it a mistake?
Sure it was. To allow him to crush the rebellion. Yes, I do too.
Did George Bush think it was a mistake? No. Did Thomas Friedman of the New York Times think it was a mistake?
I don't know. I can't speak for George Bush and Thomas Friedman.
Well, did the press think it was a mistake? I mean, just take a look back and look at the analysis.
And to allow him to have helicopters and be able to crush
Take a look at the analyses. The analysis...
Shias and who George Bush had asked to rise up?
Let's take a look at the analyses at the time. That's what we should be looking at. You can read it in, say, the New York Times, the most important newspaper in the world. Their analysis was, Alan Cowell, their Middle East correspondent, that much as we dislike the atrocities, there's an overwhelming consensus that Saddam Hussein offers more hope for the stability of the country, stability is a kind of technical word, stability of the country than the people who are trying to overthrow him. In other words, we'd rather have him than the people who are trying to overthrow him. Thomas Friedman, Thomas Friedman, who was the chief diplomatic correspondent, wrote, the best possible solution for the best possible world for the United States would be an iron-fisted military junta ruling Iraq the same way Saddam Hussein did, much to the satisfaction.
Well, I'm sure. I know Mr. Friedman, and I am sure he did not mean using the torture and using the technique. Yes.
Then why did he say it?
Well, but he may very well have believed that he may very well. First of all, I'm leery of speaking for anyone like this, of George Bush or Tom Friedman. But he may very well have meant that Iraq, because of whatever fears he had, that it would break up the balkanization of Iraq, and therefore it needed a Tito-like figure. He may have meant that.
Let's say you're right, but then see that means that from the point of view of U.S. policymakers and U.S. commentators, it wasn't a mistake. I think it was a mistake. You think it was a mistake, but they didn't.
Right.
The analysts and the policymakers thought it was right. Well, they preferred. And then let's look at the next.
I bet you the neocons, who you find so much fault with now, did not think it was a mistake.
Well, we don't know.
I mean, the Wolfowitz of the world probably don't think it was a mistake.
Well, let's take a look at the Wolfowitz.
Not to have overthrown Saddam, because I mean they've been driven by overthrowing Saddam since 1991. You'll agree with that, won't you?
No, I don't.
That they haven't been driven by the notion?
It's just too narrow a question. Let's take a look at the Wolfowitzes of the world.
Okay.
He has a record, right?
Right.
His record is, for example, strong support of General Suharto, who is certainly
when he served in Indonesia.
And afterwards, up until 1997, a couple of months before Suharto was overthrown, he was still praising him. Suharto was a mass murderer, probably worse than Saddam Hussein. He came into power killing a couple 100,000 people. He ran a regime of vicious torture and oppression. He invaded East Timor, practically destroyed it. His torture and massacres were going on right to the end of his rule. Wolfowitz was praising him because of his contributions to the growth and development of Indonesia.
At that time, Wolfowitz served as ambassador to Indonesia.
This started when he was in the State Department with responsibility for Asia, Southeast Asia in particular. Went on, he was in as ambassador to Indonesia, and it continued through his post-government service. I think he was dean.
That's Indonesia.
That's only one example. As under his watch, as State Department high official in the State Department with responsibility for Asia, the Reagan administration, under his watch, supported a whole range of murderous dictators, like Chun of South Korea. Support him up to the end.
Okay, I'm not sure. I remember Chun, and I'm not sure when he came in and when he didn't have. But there was a whole series of American administrations, which is your point exactly. A whole series of American administrations supported a whole series of leaders in South Korea.
absolutely. And Wolfowitz was in charge, almost in charge, second in command of the State Department, right up to the end. Marcos in the Philippines is another. Now, there are all kind of fake stories being concocted about this now, but I would urge people to go back to the original record and see what happened.
All right. This book, Noam Chomsky, Hegemony or Survival, America's Quest for Global Dominance. We'll talk more about all these issues with him and others. I thank you for coming.
Great.
Pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you very much.
Good.
Thank you for joining us. We went the hour. More to be said tomorrow night. Toni Morrison is here and others. See you then. Funding for Charlie Rose has been provided by the following.
The Coca-Cola Mexico Foundation built school shelters where children from remote villages stay during the week, cutting their commute to school from 6 hours to 60 seconds, satisfying a thirst for education. The Coca-Cola Company.
Additional funding for Charlie Rose was also provided by these funders.
And by Bloomberg, a provider of multimedia news and information services worldwide.
We are PBS.